I did want to talk about one other aspect of the Voting Rights Act, a huge impact it's had on the makeup of Congress and really on sort of on American politics as a whole, and that is that the Voting Rights Act, it's a bit of a complicated story, but in 1982, the Voting Rights Act was changed in a bit to encourage the creation of minority-majority congressional districts, and it took until the 1990 census when that could actually be applied to the maps, and what you saw then was an explosion basically in the 1992 elections, the first time after the 90 census. It's a significant jump in the number of African Americans and Hispanics in Congress. And those numbers, if you think of like 1994, which was a bad year for Democrats nationally, it was also a year in which African Americans reached their highest level ever in the House that year. And somebody went and actually looked at this is a little tough to explain, but if you look at if you did the electoral votes by congressional district instead of by state, so you got an electoral vote for every congressional district that you won, okay? If you look at in the 1980s, this is before we had the explosion of minority-majority districts. In the 1980s, the Democrats would outperform significantly how they did in the Electoral College in the actual election if you broke it down by congressional district. In 1992, it switches and a new pattern emerges, and Republicans begin to enjoy an advantage sort of at the congressional district level. And what it speaks to is, you know, there's been the incentive to get more African American, more Hispanic representation in Congress, but Republicans in many states have seized on this too because they've seen an opportunity to pack in Democratic voters into small, geographically compact areas, leaving much more Republican-friendly areas in the rest of the state. And that's one of the stories I think we have right now about why we talk about Republicans having, likely having a majority in the House, for the next decade or so. We say it's gerrymandering, but it's also that the population of Democratic voters gets so crunched in, and it leaves all these other Republican districts across the state. And it's a complicated thing, because I remember in 1990, when they first began creating these majority black, majority Hispanic districts, it was the Bush White House, the Bush senior White House, that was part of the push for that.
Well, actually, the creation of districts that allowed African-American voters to elect representatives of their choice. And I use that language because that's the language that the courts talk about, and I use that language intentionally and carefully because it didn't necessarily mean that they would elect African-American representatives, but in many instances they did. That started much earlier than the 1990s. What happened in the 1990s was a follow-up to the Reagan administration, when while the Reagan White House was very much opposed to the traditional civil rights policies that Democratic administrations and Republican administrations before it had pursued, the one area that they didn't change was voting rights. And that was because they did recognize that they could create what they considered to be, they didn't use this language, but an unholy alliance. The more majority black districts you created, the whiter the surrounding areas, as you pointed out. And some people have pointed to African-American representatives as the reason that Democrats have lost. I think that's an unfair charge for a lot of reasons that we could discuss, but you did have this interaction. What happened in the 1990s was that there was a series of suits after these majority black districts had been created challenging these districts, and there was a case, Shaw v. Reno, a lot of its progeny, that said that creating these districts, they were brought by white voters in the instance of the North Carolina, the Shaw case, no relation to me, by the way, that there was discrimination against white voters, putting them in these majority black districts. And they kept challenging these cases. And you had Justice O'Connor writing an opinion in which she described a 53%, 47% district, majority black, in North Carolina as, quote, political apartheid, which was problematic. And so it's a complicated conversation, a complicated discussion. At the end of the day, what I said was, why should African Americans be the ballast of for the Democratic Party, in the sense that they would have to forego electing representatives from their community in order to have Democrats take the majority in the House, for example.
Well, and what it's meant is, you look at, there have been long-serving African-American members from district, Charlie Rangel comes to mind, who was able to get a gavel, the Ways and Means Committee gavel, because of longevity in the House. Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, has climbed up into the leadership there. one thing I've noticed covering politics at the state level, and I wonder, Hakeem, how you think about this, but one thing I've noticed covering, state politics in states that have VRA districts is the sort of state political establishment, the state Democratic establishment in these states often looks at candidates, members of Congress who come from those districts, and they almost stigmatize them. And they almost say, you're from the majority black district, we can't market you across the state. It's probably totally unfair, but I've definitely picked up on those attitudes talking to Democratic Party leaders.
Well, that has existed in the past. I think that's begun to change, obviously, with the elevation of Barack Obama to the presidency. He's indicated tremendous crossover appeal. Cory Booker, I think, we'll see win an election in New Jersey. But you're absolutely right that there is a tendency amongst some, I've heard the expression used, to ghettoize African-American leaders from majority black districts. But there's a broader issue here that's at stake. One, I think it is important that we have seen an explosion of representatives from the African-American and Latino community in Congress. In fact, this Democratic conference is the most diverse in the history of the Republic. For the first time, a majority are women, people of color, and members of the LGBT community. But the paradox, of course, is that we're also in the minority. And part of the issue is that I think the Republicans across the country have used redistricting instead of creating an opportunity to elect district, where the African-American community or Latino community has a meaningful opportunity to elect a representative of its choice. They've chosen instead to create these supermajority districts, pack voters into isolated, narrowly drawn congressional districts, and then spread Republicans out throughout the state. And that is really what has created the problem that needs to be addressed.
All right. I want to thank Theodore Shaw, former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Democratic Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of New York. 5 ways the Supreme Court could allow gay marriage. That's after this.